Hello, everyone. Welcome to World Review, our weekly look at the news from around the world. I'm Carla Robbins, co-host of the World Next Week podcast from the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor at Baruch College's Marx School in New York, sitting in for the redoubtable Ivo Daalder. It's 1 year after Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. We were just talking about it. We're not going to call it an anniversary. And we're going to be looking at the state of the war and where the US, Russia, and China stand as the conflict grinds on. This week, Biden went to Kyiv and Poland, and he pledged that the US and NATO, with their support, will never waver. But can he really deliver on that pledge? A few hours after the Kyiv visit, Putin gave his State of the Nation address. And while he didn't bang his shoe on the lectern, he came pretty close. How much sacrifice can he impose on the Russian people? And how much sacrifice can he ask of the Russian military? And another question, is this the start of a new arms race? And finally, China seems to want to get more involved, although exactly how isn't clear. The US has charged that Beijing may be close to sending weapons and ammunition to Russia, and President Xi claims to have a peace plan. Here with us to discuss all of these issues from Washington, my longtime friend Karen DeYoung, who is the associate editor and senior national security correspondent for the Washington Post. Hey, Karen.
Hi.
From Brussels, my longtime friend and former colleague, always colleague, Stephen Erlanger, who is the chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. And from Washington, Nirmal Ghosh, U.S. bureau chief for the Straits Times. I've only seen Nirmal across a crowded Zoom, and we need to fix that pretty soon. So thank you all for being here. Karen, can we start with you?
Absolutely.
Great. So it seemed like pretty much everyone described Biden's visit to Kyiv as a surprise. Were you surprised? And why was the White House so determined to make this trip, which was a logistical nightmare?
Well, I think the first thing we have to say is this entire week has been carefully choreographed to have some big event every day. I think we all sort of assumed that because Biden had a trip scheduled to Warsaw this week that he would go to Kyiv, although they kept not actually denying it, but just saying he's going to Warsaw. What was surprising about it was that usually these so-called surprise visits happen at the end of an overseas trip, and this one happened at the beginning. The president and his wife went out to dinner on Saturday night. They went to a museum. They went home. We were told that that was it for the night. He was supposed to leave late Sunday to go to Warsaw. And then the next thing we knew, Monday morning, he was in Kyiv. What they'd done was spirited him out of the White House at about 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, took him to Andrews Air Force Base, flew to Poland, and then he was on a 10-hour train trip inside Kyiv, only to sort of magically appear there with President Zelensky. They posed for the cameras. They had private talks. All in all, Biden was there for about 5 hours, got back on the train for another 10 hours, went back to Poland, and then continued with his visit to Warsaw. So it was very, I would say, more symbol than substance. Although certainly anytime he can talk face to face to Zelensky increases his knowledge and U.S. knowledge about what's happening there. And it's always good to see what's happening on the ground. And I think it also bolstered the spirits of the Ukrainians. He gave some talks, and then he gave a very strong speech in Warsaw. The trip to Ukraine, he went 6 times to Ukraine when he was vice president. And I went on 2 of those trips with him. They were all about Ukrainian corruption. They were all about how we were going to get Ukraine to be a better democracy. And this trip obviously was very, very different. And Biden talked about it in his speech later in Warsaw, talked about the night of the Russian invasion and his conversation with Zelensky then, talked about Western unity, talked about how this has been a test for the West, and the West has passed it, how we could have looked the other way, and we didn't look the other way. So I think that Biden can overall claim some success. Ukraine is still standing. NATO under US leadership is more united than ever and growing. So the choreography continued this week. On Wednesday, there was the beginning of a General Assembly meeting. On Thursday, the General Assembly took a vote, and 141 nations voted to condemn the Russian invasion and call for Russian withdrawal. We all did our Russian anniversary pieces and packages talking about various things. Today, there's a Security Council meeting with Foreign Minister. Secretary Blinken just finished speaking, I think. It was interesting that the meeting started out with the Russian delegate objecting to the fact that the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba was going to be allowed to speak before any of the council members, and that objection was rejected. Again, we've also seen Putin marking this week, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later.
I just want to ask you another question. This is the thing that, and I have my moments in which I really miss being in Washington and reporting, and this is one of the questions that I really want to have answered. And we were told that they reached out to the Russians before Biden went, and they said he's going.
Right.
We know who made that call. Do we know what threat went with that call? This is the term they used was deconfliction.
Right.
Do we know anything more about that? And do you think how much of a debate was there about whether or not they were going to try to sneak in or made that decision to call the Russians?
I think they called the Russians very much at the last minute. We don't know exactly who made the call. I assume it was Jake Sullivan calling his counterpart in Moscow. I don't know that though. Yeah, and I think that again, it was very last minute. It was saying, look, this is happening. You don't want to kill the U.S. president. We don't want you to kill the U.S. president. So just keep that in mind. And in fact, it was pretty quiet that day in Kyiv. So I think that, this is these deconflictions. It might have been the military calling the military. That's how they do it in Syria, where they have an open line. And when they say, look, we don't want to get in a war with each other, we're going to be here, stay away. So I think it's a system that actually works quite well and is pretty much the only system other than these periodic public shouting matches at the United Nations where the Russians and the Americans are in direct contact with each other.
So, I mean, which is, and we will get to that because that is rather frightening when you can think two countries with so many nuclear weapons are barely talking, but we will get to that. So Steve, Biden's speech in Poland sounded pretty self-congratulatory, as noted. It's both about the state of the alliance and, and its support for Ukraine. NATO is certainly held together better than many of us expected. Is it as united as Biden claims? And, what did we learn from Biden's visit, in a whole host of meetings this week?
Well, again, as Karen says, a lot of this was symbolism built around this anniversary because the media gets all excited about a year of that and 2 years of this and 5 years since then. And so, Biden clearly wanted to take advantage of it. It's very important that he be seen by the American people as a leader, as someone who is doing the right thing and marshaling his allies and the Ukrainians are really good at making videos. They made great videos of Biden's visit. In fact, I was wondering, frankly, with the deconfliction, whether the air raid siren that went off while they were walking around was part of Ukraine's showmanship to show how brave the two presidents were.
So
but
cynical.
that's just cynical.
Erlanger.
Well, it's hard to tell because they set off those alarms. They monitor whenever a plane takes off from what they know.
Sure. I'm just saying,
base.
It occurred to me. I wondered because it was all designed for television. It wasn't designed for media,
and potentially for
other sorts of
campaign
press.
Video for Biden too.
Oh, no, of course. And he should be proud. I mean, Biden is a transatlanticist. He has marshaled the West in response to this Russian aggression, which is real and which breaks international law and breaks Russia's agreements and breaks the UN Charter by a member of the Security Council. So had he failed to do this, I think he'd be in real trouble, but they have done it very, very well, and they have kept the West together. The problem is, they always say, we're with Ukraine as long as it takes. We never know what it is, and we never know what how long is. And that's the conversation underneath. I went to the Munich Security Conference this year, which was particularly interesting and particularly dissonant, because you had on the stage all these full-throated moral rhetorical statements from Baltic leaders and Polish leaders and American leaders about undying support for Ukraine, whatever they need as long as it takes. But the reality is we're not giving them everything they want. We're being very, very slow on certain things. We could have started producing more ammunition 8 months ago. We could have started fixing Western tanks a year ago. It's been, there are reasons for criticism, let's be fair, but the fact is NATO has, as Karen said, it's come together, it's enlarging, there are more troops on the Russian border. It has served quite correctly and well to deterring any Russian ideas of crossing into NATO territory, though I don't think Putin would ever dare that. Even if he wins in Ukraine, my guess is he would then next turn to Moldova or even to Kazakhstan, not to NATO. But Biden's speech was kind of a homily. The disaster of Afghanistan seems quite a long time ago. And the real worry people have, as I say, is how can Ukraine survive a long war? Many Ukrainians worry that it cannot. And how long a war can it be? And when Zelensky talks about trying to finish it this year, is that even possible? And should the United States push Ukraine even quietly toward what some would consider, I know I can get criticized for even repeating other people's views, some would consider to be more realistic war aims, because this goes into a third year or a fourth year, we, I think, would be having very different conversations.
Can I say, I think that it's interesting to see what's happening here in Washington, where you have the Republicans are trying very hard to figure out what their entry point is for criticism of this. And there are basically two of them, and they kind of contradict each other. One is that, as Steve said, the administration has been too slow to give Ukraine what it needs. And the other is that they've given them too much and they're spending too much money on it. Although, it must be said that virtually all of this money is going to the US defense industry and is staying in this country. So it's creating jobs, and it's doing things that a lot of Republicans and others would have said needed to be done anyway, in terms of looking at U.S. readiness and increasing things. So I think that I was at the coalition conference last week, which was held in Brussels, and I've been at several of them, and it was really a different feeling. There really was this feeling of urgency that if they don't make progress, if the Ukrainians don't make progress this spring, they're in for a bad time. That a war of attrition really doesn't favor Ukraine. And if they don't push really hard and really fast now, they're going to be in difficulty.
So, Nirmal, so Steve referenced the Munich Security Conference. There was an enormous amount of hand-wringing, although I think legitimate, about how much of the rest of the world outside of Europe is either sitting on the fence or buying into the Russian position on this war. Only 33 countries have imposed sanctions on Russia, and the UN General Assembly vote on Thursday was, 141 countries voted in favor of calling for Russia to get out. And the usual suspects voted against it, including Belarus and North Korea and Syria and Nicaragua. What a great group of guys there. But 32 abstained, including India and South Africa. And right now, as we speak, the South African Navy is holding military exercises with Russia and China in the Indian Ocean. And they certainly don't consider Russia a pariah state. Why are the US and Europe having such a hard time with this? If I were a small country, I would find this very threatening.
Yeah, of 32 that abstained, is much of Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, and including, of course, as you say, China and India. Now, interestingly, of course, the thing everybody's watching now is China's role in all this. China has now been thrust forward into a more interesting role. And their top diplomat, Wang Yi, was in Moscow just a couple of days ago. He apparently told Vladimir Putin on Wednesday that China-Russia relations would not be influenced by any third party. The Chinese Foreign Ministry statement said Wang Yi called for peace efforts. He said, he hoped relevant parties would create conditions for dialogue and negotiation. Now, Russia, of course, has been stressing the idea of the West ganging up on Russia and China, so they must stick together. Nikolai Patrushev, who is Secretary of Russia's Security Council, apparently said in the context of the campaign by the collective West to contain Russia and China, they want to deepen relations, And after the meeting, just yesterday, China came out with a position paper, which contains 12 points. I won't go through this, it's lengthy, but the top three are basically
Thank you.
respecting the sovereignty of all countries, double standards must be rejected, abandoning the Cold War mentality, ceasing hostilities, all parties should resume direct dialogue and all that. So this is really a rehash of China's known positions. If there is to be any movement on that front, it will be likely only when President Xi Jinping visits Moscow, which is expected. People are saying in the next 4 weeks or so. So let's say March. Putin had invited Xi for a state visit last December, but China has not yet actually responded publicly. However, this meeting with Wang Yi in Moscow would have paved the way for that visit. Now, just hours after the position paper was posted, Chinese Twitter handle Chao Dashui, which appears very well connected, said that China is working on a peace plan which would call for large patches of territories in eastern Ukraine, currently under Russian occupation, to be demilitarized zones. This has been mentioned here as well by a couple of people, a sort of Korean model, a frozen war, not an active war. But there is very little chance of that being accepted right now by either side in this conflict or in the near future, I would say. So briefly, militarily, we are in a stalemate. There is almost zero prospect of a diplomatic settlement because neither side is ready to give up. In fact, we are still in the stage of intensification. Politically, China would like a divided Europe, but it also cannot abandon Russia. It has no other partner anywhere in the world with the strategic weight of Russia that shares China's distrust of the US. So China is still sees Russia as a central element of its strategy to weaken US power in a multipolar world, but also doesn't want China to, and it also doesn't want China to collapse. So it is navigating a very thin line there. And that comes back to the question that arises from the rhetoric we have seen. I think Steve mentioned, what does defeating Russia look like? About China giving lethal aid to Russia, it would be a serious mistake. Stupid, in fact, for China to do that. And China has denied it would do that. The US would make it pay. It would further tank the US-China relationship, which is already on the rocks, and neither Beijing nor Washington want that. So Putin and Xi Jinping still hope to break European unity. In fact, Peter Szijjártó, Hungary's foreign minister, has famously been decrying the escalatory effects of sanctions on Russia and weapons sales to Ukraine. But Hungary has not formally stepped out of the European line. So for now, there is little prospect of Western unity breaking. But it is not impossible in the longer run, say 2 years, 5 years from now. Support in the global south is soft and will probably soften even further because the planetary economy is suffering. This includes most of Southeast Asia. And by the way, Vietnam on China's border also gets most of its weapons from Russia and in fact, Ukraine. So there is a lot of incentive across the global south for this war to be brought to negotiated end. So Wang Yi's trip to Moscow would have paved the way for a visit there by Xi Jinping. And that is when we may see an actual concrete proposal. But the best one can hope for possibly is a ceasefire. So I'll stop there.
So you jumped the gun on my China questions, and so I'm going to come back to you on another question later. I want to let's talk about Putin and arms control then, and that speech. Steve, you and I grew up in the Cold War. Or is this the start of a new arms race? I mean, all the skill sets that I have there, which is counting weapons and all that. Am I going to be in demand again?
Yeah, and I spent a good part of my career in the Soviet world. So do I have to remember all that again?
Right.
No, I thought Putin's speech was less interesting than I thought it would be. It didn't actually make any dramatic statements or indicate any dramatic acts. I think he is, as my colleagues have said, counting on a long war, wearing down the Ukrainians and wearing down the West. And obviously, if China were to provide even small amounts of missiles and ammunition, that could make the war even longer and turn it into more of a global struggle. So I hope Nirmal's right. I think he's right, but let's see. On arms control, it is really depressing, right? Because New START is the last one left. Actually, Russia wanted the extension of New START because it didn't want to have to invest in more nuclear weapons. Now, Putin says he's going to suspend participation, which in a way he's already did. That's what happened to the INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty as well. Russia basically stopped obeying it. And so everyone else pulled the plug on it. Now, some people who are more religiously oriented in terms of nukes, right? I mean, people who tend to be obsessed with nukes, it's become a religion with them, believe that in fact, arms control in the future won't make much sense without China, because China is very rapidly increasing its own nuclear stockpile. Some Americans think it was 300 a couple of years ago, that it's now 600 warheads, and that it's getting bigger and bigger.
The Pentagon is saying they're going up to 1,500 in the next.
Yes, well, maybe they are and maybe they aren't, but that's, I suppose, the Pentagon's estimate. I always try to remember the Washington spins as much as every other government, particularly on things like this. But if China isn't involved in nuclear arms limitation talks, there may not be any point to it, because as much as Russia and China have this eternal lasting friendship, one of the reasons they each have nuclear weapons is against one another. So I am quite depressed about it. And I think it makes a more dangerous world, because we might have more testing going on, and it could put a big hole in the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which Iran already seems to be doing anyway. So we're heading into, I think, a world where deterrence among the big powers seemed relatively conservative and safe, but nuclear weapons spreading even in small amounts to lots of powers feels pretty dangerous to me.
Yeah, if I may jump in, I concur totally with Steve. I think strategists in Asia have sort of predicted for some time that the rise of China will sort of spur Japan to do more, which we are seeing. Then we are listening to sounds in South Korea about nuclear, and I think this is really the beginning of, maybe not the last nail in the coffin, but pretty close to it, of nuclear non-proliferation. And we're going to see a new era of great powers armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, and hopefully parity. But as we have seen and has been proved, people go to war under the umbrella of nuclear weapons, and can't stop a conventional war. You can limit it, can't stop it.
And if I can just add one more point about Ukraine, I mean, Russia's nuclear arsenal is deterring the United States and the West from getting more involved in Ukraine. I mean, obviously, we say we'll do anything for Ukraine except fight for it. And that's the reason why.
Yeah. So, which is a different form of deterrence, yes, self-deterrence. So,
yes.
Karen, if Steve and Nirmal are right, and I fear they are, if there is any chance of getting things somewhat back on track, there were high hopes that, Biden, who seemed to be a believer in arms control, was going to come in. And there were a lot of things that had to be done beyond, reducing the U.S. arsenal and the U.S. budget, and the sort of no first use declarations when Steve talks about religion. But really important things like opening up a negotiation with the Russians on tactical weapons, which is the thing that everyone's been so worried about and that have never been under any negotiation, and bringing the Chinese to the table. And there were high hopes that Biden's people, who were old arms controllers, would do this. What's the feeling? Was this all sort of OBE long before Putin started talking this way, or do you think there's any chance that there might be a push for this now?
I think one of the big questions about the sort of post-Ukraine world is, what is the West's relationship with Russia? Right now, the language is across the board completely negative. Russia's a pariah state. You cannot deal with Russia. They lie. But if you go back just a decade, NATO's position was, we need to have a relationship with Russia. Let's have a dialogue. And I think that right now, all of that has gone out the window. But I still think there's a big question. All of the reasons why they wanted to have that dialogue are still there after Ukraine. And it's just not clear how the world is going to find its way back to that. I think the Russians, again, I agree with Steve, Putin's speech was kind of, it was kind of strange. I mean, there was a lot of sort of table pounding rhetoric about Ukraine and the evilness of the West and how this was really a war between Russia and the United States. But if you look at what happened with New START, they supposedly had a missile test last week, and despite saying they were out of the treaty, they did, as the treaty calls for, inform the United States beforehand. And I think what they're particularly out of now is the inspection regime that was part of that treaty. So, but there weren't any inspections going on anyway.
Pre-COVID, since
right,
COVID, yeah.
Right. In terms of the Biden administration, Trump had refused the 5-year extension of New START and sort of demanded that China be brought into the talks. And that didn't happen. And the treaty was not extended. The extension date came right after Biden was inaugurated, and Biden did extend it. So I think, they want that to continue. You're quite right. They're all big arms controllers. And so, but I think those are just questions we really can't answer right now. And it all depends on, again, what this relationship is going to be. I mean, this war will end at some point, and it depends on what that relationship is going to be, what the Russian-Chinese relationship is after that. I think Steve made some very good points about why they need each other, and China simultaneously pushes them back. But they both see each other as a bulwark against what they consider U.S. hegemony.
And so, Nirmal, do we have any understanding for why the Chinese went from having, as Steve said, 300 nuclear weapons to suddenly deciding that they want to? Because if the Pentagon is right, and they may not be right, they are on a trajectory to building up to an arsenal that's the same size as what the New START limitations were in the first place. The Chinese have always said, we can't be part of these negotiations. You can't tell us to, because you guys have this very high number and we're really all the way down here. Why would you want to take away our weapons? Do we understand what's going on there thinking about nuclear weapons?
Not really. Actually, one of the issues with China, of course, as we know, is the opacity of the regime, right? It's very, very difficult to really understand what the inner circle is strategically thinking. But I would say on the face of it, it's just a question of reaching parity and in establishing a multipolar world where everybody is actually at parity, which means like you would take a couple of hundred, you have X number of missiles of nuclear tipped warheads each. That I would say is probably the issue.
I think if you really wanted to be cynical, you could say it's the same reason as has already been pointed out, why NATO and the United States don't want to get involved on the ground in Ukraine. If China is at parity in terms of its nuclear arsenal, and it decides it wants to invade Taiwan, are we going to say, no, we're going to go in and stop them? You could make that argument. I don't know if Nirmal agrees with this, but I think that's the sort of cynical argument to make, that it leaves China free to do what it wants in the same way that Russia feels free to do what it wants without a direct response from NATO and the United States.
Yeah,
Well,
I kind of agree.
300 nuclear weapons could mess up your day, and I'm not sure the marginal difference between 300 and 600 is
yeah, it is a cynical view, but it's probably realistic. Even if China does not, and nobody actually believes that China wants to invade Taiwan imminently. Mm-hmm. This is, an artificial thing, which is
except for the U.S. Pacific
become a little hysterical. But they want to be able to say, look, we have the means to do so, and that's, that we armed retreat, just like Karen is saying that Russia has. Basically, and Steve, Russia has deterred the U.S. from NATO from interfering.
I do remember Mao Zedong used to say everyone should have nukes, but this China is quite different.
So Karen, the Biden administration has been really adept at the preemptive use of intelligence. I mean, we saw this, in rallying NATO, and so when Blinken said the Chinese were thinking about sending arms to China, do we know how much intelligence they actually have? Is there a sign they're going to come out with it? The Journal had a piece just now saying that they're thinking about coming out with this information.
Yeah, they are. They are thinking about making another release. I mean, but I don't know. How do you release intelligence that says a country is thinking about doing something without proving where you got that information in a way that might not be as easy to do with China or as seemingly the correct thing to do with China in terms of our posture vis-a-vis China, as it was with Russia, to say Russia was planning this false flag operation. We've monitored these conversations. We have spies that are inside that are telling us this. So far they've just said, starting I guess with Blinken last weekend, saying, we believe that they're considering it. I don't know how you prove that without. I don't know what the evidence is and why they would think it's a good idea to release that evidence, but they are definitely thinking about that. There's no question about that. I don't know what it is.
It would have been one of the options on the table for China to consider. I mean,
yeah,
that's their job.
Yeah, exactly.
To consider contingencies.
Right.
Although if it were just a contingency, for Biden, for Blinken to come out of that, this really raises the question about how much confrontation they want to have, and particularly at a period of time in which there was this hope that this meeting in Munich was going to be a chance to make up for having canceled the trip for Balloon Gate, and then to come out and accuse them of something guaranteed that this was not going to be a warm and fuzzy meeting.
Well, accuse them of thinking about something.
That's what I mean.
Strange, yeah.
Well, that guaranteed that shall we say that the feeling at the table was not going to be warm.
And you saw the Chinese response, which is, what are you warning us? How dare you? What are you doing, warning us? Look what you're doing.
Yeah, and they have also denied it, sort of fiercely denied it. So Steve, the China's top diplomat was in Europe, and he was at Munich, but he also took other meetings, and he was selling hard. He's telling Macron, and he told Scholz from Germany that China's back in business after COVID. It's eager to cooperate on other things like climate. That we're actually not bad. Were the Europeans buying it? And particularly, he has the potential for playing on a certain measure of European resentment on the question of secondary sanctions for chips. And if the Chinese really were to give arms, the threat would be cutting them off from the financial system, all sorts of things that would really mess up the Europeans' days. I think the Chinese, where are the Europeans on this?
To be honest, had Wang Yi wanted to sell the Europeans better, he would have had a different speech in Munich. I mean, his speech in Munich was so aimed at the United States and in such extreme terms, I think it put quite a lot of people off. Even today, which happens to be Estonia's 105th anniversary of independence.
So that is an anniversary, not just
that's an anniversary.
That's an anniversary.
And Ursula von der Leyen and Jens Stoltenberg were in Tallinn together with Kaja Kallas, and of course they used it to talk again about anything Ukraine wants, we're there forever. But one of the things Stoltenberg said was that he repeated this warning, and it is a warning, but he also said we have no evidence that there has been any lethal weapons supplied by China to Russia for Ukraine. So I think it's clearly a shot across the bow, if I can put it that way. And I'm sure it's a debate inside China. Of course it is. And I'm sure Russia wants the stuff. I mean, it wants even cheap chips, so it doesn't have to destroy all of its refrigerators to make missiles. And it would like ammo and it would like missiles. But I think China is trying to be very careful on sort of balancing this. Now, it is also true that Europe does not see China as a peer rival the way the US does. It is not obsessed with China. It is worried about Chinese espionage. It's worried about lots of things, but it sees China much more as a kind of troublesome but necessary trade partner. And it is. I mean, Europe trades a lot. And, two-way trade with Russia since the sanctions has dropped by 140 billion euros. So trade has to go somewhere, right? So, people are talking in Europe about resilience, about not being too dependent on any one country, i.e. China, for batteries, for lithium, for face masks, for drugs, but this is going to take quite a while. And the Germans know this too, but it's not something that can happen right away. So Scholz and Emmanuel Macron will visit Beijing and they will talk to the Chinese, and there's no reason why they shouldn't, because they've also been very clear about Ukraine. So it is different. It's not the Washington anxiety. And at the same time, China has friends in Hungary and different places. But splitting Europe, I mean, Europe's already split, right? I mean, some countries do a lot of trade with China and some countries don't. China went after some little countries that opened up Taiwanese offices, right? And you could argue that the EU was too soft in actually defending its member states, but I don't think anybody's naive about China. And even today, von der Leyen said, let's remember China's taken sides on Ukraine. So we will look at any Chinese proposal for negotiations with a great deal of salt.
So we have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to be really unfair here. And so I'm going to pose the Final Jeopardy question. I wish we had the Final Jeopardy music to go with it. Nirmal, if we get together, when we get together a year from now, what's it going to look like? What's the war in Ukraine going to look like? It's over.
I think the
Settled?
the best case scenario is the war will continue, but it'll be in a more formalized stalemate. At some point, if you look at global opinion as well, which has been polled, again, going back to the divide at the UN, the global south is against the war being prolonged and so forth. Pressure will build as economies keep tanking around the globe. Energy, supply chains, the whole works. I think the best we can hope for is the war will continue, but there will be some kind of ceasefire by then. There are some diplomatic meetings coming up. The G20 is going to happen later this year. India is the chair. We have to watch the ministerial and the G20 very carefully to see what emerges from there. So there will be a lot of diplomacy, and I think we can hope for a ceasefire, but it's not going to be the end of the war.
Steve?
I basically agree with that. I think, as Karen said, the US and the West are trying to get Ukraine ready for a serious counteroffensive in late March, early April, hoping to change the situation on the ground. But no one really expects them to drive the Russians altogether out of Ukraine. So I think we're going to move into more of a hyper defense mode that could lead to a ceasefire, though I'm not sure why Putin would be interested in peace talks of any kind if he believes a long war is in his interest.
Yeah, one last quick point. Putin is not the kind of guy who backs down. If you look at his history, what he said about Ukraine, what his thoughts are about Russia and all that, he's not going to give an inch. Whatever
Karen,
happens.
you get the last word here.
I
And
don't
we're not, of
disagree
course,
with-
we're not recording this, and we'll never hold it against you.
Right. I don't disagree with any of that. I think a lot depends on what happens over the next few months. I think the Pentagon was sort of saying, up until June, we wait and see what happens. And everybody makes the point that offense is a lot harder than defense. And both sides have pretty much, although they've been inching back and forth, have been on defense. And as they both sort of go all out to go on offense, it just depends on who wins. I think, and winning is not overall winning. Winning is pushing the other side back from where it is now. And I don't think either side is gonna push the other back to a point that's going to actually end the war. So there will be more pressure for a ceasefire, more pressure for some kind of negotiations.
Well, we will see. And thank you all so much. That's it for this week's edition of World Review from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to thank Nirmal Ghosh of the Straits Times, Steve Erlanger of the New York Times, and Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post for a great conversation on the 1 year, not anniversary, marking this very grim 1 year. Eva will be back in 2 weeks, and I hope to see you all here next week. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.